A new book called Dispersals on plants, borders, and belonging traces the history of how we moved plants around and asks, what does it mean to be a plant out of place? And how does the movement of plants mirror our own? Jessica J. Lee is an environmental historian and the author of Dispersals. She's based in Berlin, Germany. Jessica, welcome to Science Friday.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show. Jessica, what inspired you to write this book?
I think, honestly, the question at the core of this idea of, how do we think about plants out of place, plants that push at our understandings of what it means to belong? It was a question that had been sitting with me for many years before I started really writing the book. I was hiking in the mountains in central Taiwan, and I'd stopped on a trail because I had encountered just a scent. Actually, I didn't even know what plant it was coming from, but it smelled like almond cookies or like baked goods in some way. And I was like, what is this? I searched and searched and found these flowers that were growing on the mountainside, took a photo because I didn't know what they were. And I went home and looked it up, and it was Chinese knotweed, a particular variety of it that grows in Taiwan that is native to Taiwan. And I dug into it a little bit more, and then, of course, learned that it is considered a pretty severe invasive in other parts of the world. And something about, I think, the beauty and poignancy of the encounter I'd had with it and this classification, the language used to describe it, I couldn't hold the two things together. And I thought, this is bizarre, right? How do you make sense of something that has these, I think, pejorative terms attached to it, these negative connotations, when in certain contexts they're so beautiful, they're so enchanting? And I sort of sat with that question for a couple of years. I think for myself, as a migrant who comes from three generations of migrants, as a mixed race person, a lot of that language felt uncomfortable to me. And I didn't really know how to touch it for a long time until eventually I thought, okay, this is something I need to start unpacking. What do we mean when we call a plant out of place? And how does that resonate with how we speak about people?
We really do hear over and over that non-native species are bad and that they're ruining our gardens and forests, outcompeting local flora and causing these cascading effects across our ecosystems. So how did you tackle that and balance that concern, which is, a real concern, with an appreciation of these plants?
I think that the big thing for me is it's not questioning those impacts, right? I'm not making an argument that is in favor of, I think, denying the negative impacts of certain species. I think for me, it's about getting away from a language that wholly villainizes a plant that very often is a plant that we've picked up and moved,
Yeah.
that we've brought as an ornamental, or we've hauled around, in ballast waters through our shipping industries. And just saying, what if we had better language for how to describe these plants, but also just told richer stories where we understood the agency of those plants, the agency of humans in creating those situations? If we understood and sort of wrote back into the story the richness and fullness of what those plants do in their home environments and the resilience that they have. And, in some situations, really begin to also ask questions about potential positive impacts that there could be in some places.
You really drive home throughout the book that context is important. You use the example of giant hogweed. Can you tell me about that?
I wanted to write about giant hogweed because I was living in the UK for part of when I wrote this book, and I've lived in the UK a lot in my life. It's very often seen as, the most dangerous plant in Britain. It's the sort of most offensive, most egregious weed. And it really is a plant that you want to avoid. It causes phytochemical burns that can, cause problems for years after contact with the plant. So it's definitely one that you don't question that there's a problem with it. And it really thrives in abandoned plots, in disturbed ground. But one of the reasons I really wanted to look at it was this history of it. It was brought over to Britain as an ornamental plant. It was actually a prized Victorian garden plant until it jumped the garden wall, right? There's that phrase from a historian named Harriet Bitfo that it's like, plants are okay until they sort of misbehave, right? Until they leap over the wall. And I really wanted to sort of explore that, but then to say, these plants also aren't staying in place, right? So we have giant hogweed cast as this villain at the moment. But actually, as the climate changes and becomes more unstable, it needs to move. It's not actually doing that well where it is in the UK, and is going to be moving northward because it needs colder winters. And so there's this part of me that I don't know, I'm really fascinated by this idea of a plant we've moved, villainized, and now because of anthropogenic climate change also needs to move again.
To learn more and never miss your daily dose of science, subscribe to our podcast.